On August 15th, the world's attention turned to Anchorage, Alaska, where the United States and Russia met face-to-face in a rare and high-stakes 3-on-3 negotiation. Alongside President Donald Trump and Secretary of State Marco Rubio sat a figure who immediately drew both curiosity and controversy: Steve Witkoff. Known primarily as a real estate developer and billionaire with close personal ties to the administration, Witkoff carried the title of Special Envoy. Yet few could explain precisely what role he was meant to play at the table. For weeks leading up to the meeting, Washington insiders whispered that his presence reflected the president's preference for loyal confidants over seasoned diplomats. To the American public, the optics raised uncomfortable questions. Why was a businessman with no diplomatic record-shaping policy in a negotiation that could alter the global balance of power? The summit itself was billed as a defining moment, an opportunity to demonstrate America's resolve. But almost immediately after the talks concluded, rumors circulated that Witkoff's contributions leaned less toward strategy and more toward business-style proposals. One anonymous staffer described his tone as transactional, more concerned with potential investments and trade openings than with deterrence or defense. Another observer claimed that Witkoff spoke as though he were closing a deal, not defending a nation. These accounts unsettled analysts, who warned that reducing matters of security to the language of commerce risked sending the wrong message to Moscow. By the evening news cycle, the narrative had already begun to take shape. Footage of Witkoff standing stiffly beside Rubio and Trump, nodding but rarely speaking, played against commentary that questioned his legitimacy. Some anchors praised him as an outsider unafraid to think differently, but many more criticized his lack of experience, pointing out that this was not a real estate boardroom. It was a battlefield of geopolitics. The contrast between the expectations of unwavering resolve and the reality of a billionaire businessman negotiating with Russia was too striking to ignore. Into this growing uncertainty stepped Representative Jasmine Crockett, a sharp critic unafraid to pierce the veil of political theater. With her characteristic bluntness, she issued a statement within hours. America deserves diplomats at the table, not developers. The stakes were national security, not real estate. Her words struck a nerve, echoing across television screens and social media feeds. By nightfall, hashtags like "Wrong Man at the Table" and "Witkoff Fail" surged online, setting the stage for a political confrontation that promised to grow only more intense. By the following morning, the whispers surrounding Steve Witkoff's role in the August 15th negotiations had taken on a sharper edge. Journalists digging into the substance of the talks began to report that his interventions had focused less on matters of security and more on opportunities for economic cooperation. While officials tried to frame these moments as a natural part of diplomacy, leaks from individuals familiar with the discussion suggested otherwise. According to one staffer, Witkoff repeatedly referenced mutually beneficial investments, language that sounded more like a real estate pitch than a diplomatic position. Another claimed that at least one Russian negotiator seemed amused, remarking privately that the American envoy speaks like a banker, not a statesman. The story gained traction quickly. Morning news shows replayed clips of Witkoff's brief public remarks, noting how often he leaned on phrases like partnerships, growth, and opportunities rather than deterrence or defense. Analysts pointed out the stark contrast. While the world had expected hard lines on military deployments, Witkoff's vocabulary seemed pulled from a business seminar. He went to a geopolitical showdown with the mindset of closing a deal, one commentator quipped. That may work in Manhattan boardrooms, but not when sitting across from Moscow. Representative Jasmine Crockett pounced on the revelations with surgical precision. At a press availability outside the Capitol, she delivered a cutting statement. When the stakes are national security, America cannot afford a negotiator who treats defense as if it were a trade deal. Steve Witkoff walked into that room as a businessman and forgot that he was supposed to be a guardian of our country's interests. That is not just unprofessional, it's dangerous. Her words ignited immediate reaction online. Within hours, hashtags like "Deals Not Defense" and "Witkoff Unfit" were trending nationwide. The administration attempted to brush off the criticism, framing Witkoff as an innovative voice bringing fresh perspectives. But the explanation rang hollow to a public already skeptical of his qualifications. Editorial pages began publishing op-eds questioning why a billionaire developer had been trusted with such responsibility in the first place. Internationally, commentators expressed alarm, warning that the U.S. appeared distracted, placing loyalty above expertise at the most crucial of junctures. For Witkoff, what had started as quiet doubts about his presence had now become a firestorm over his performance. And for Jasmine Crockett, the path forward was clear. She would not simply criticize his presence, she would challenge his very right to sit at the table of power. As scrutiny of Steve Witkoff's presence at the August 15th summit intensified, Washington was rattled by a fresh wave of leaks, this time carrying explosive claims about what had been said behind those closed doors. According to multiple anonymous briefings, Witkoff had taken the lead during several exchanges, not on matters of defense or strategy, but on what sources described as economic openings. Staffers familiar with the notes claimed that he floated the idea of easing certain restrictions in exchange for vague promises of stability guarantees. One official, speaking under condition of anonymity, put it bluntly. It sounded less like diplomacy and more like a pitch deck. The details painted a troubling picture. Instead of pressing Moscow on military deterrence, Witkoff allegedly proposed frameworks for joint development projects, suggesting that economic cooperation might serve as a foundation for peace. To the Russians, the comments may have sounded like an invitation to negotiate from strength. To Americans back home, they looked dangerously close to economic concessions that carried no binding security commitments. He treated national security as if it were a real estate negotiation, remarked one congressional aide who reviewed the leak. That's not diplomacy, it's business in a suit and tie. News outlets seized on the revelations, their chyrons blazing with headlines like "Special Envoy or Business Broker" and "Witkoff's Negotiating Style Sparks Uproar." Editorial writers raised urgent questions. Was the Secretary of State sidelined while an unelected billionaire pitched economic deals to Moscow? And if so, what message did that send about America's priorities in the room? Jasmine Crockett wasted no time sharpening the attack. Standing in front of reporters, she spoke with an intensity that left no ambiguity. When the world expected a defense of our security, Steve Witkoff offered a sales pitch. That is not courage, that is carelessness. And carelessness on the world stage puts every American family at risk. Her statement hit the airwaves like a thunderclap, instantly dominating social media. Hashtags such as #PitchNot Policy and Witkoff Exposed trended nationwide, with users posting memes of Witkoff holding blueprints instead of defense documents. The White House issued a terse denial, claiming that economic dimensions are always part of comprehensive talks. But the pushback failed to calm the storm. Across cable networks, retired diplomats and national security experts voiced alarm. One put it starkly: if these leaks are accurate, the Russians walked away with the impression that America is for sale. For Jasmine Crockett, the revelations were a gift. a chance to cast Witkoff not simply as inexperienced, but as reckless. And for the American public, the image of a billionaire developer treating geopolitics like a business deal was beginning to stick. The scandal had crossed a new threshold. This was no longer about doubts. It was about trust, and whether Steve Witkoff had betrayed it inside that negotiation chamber. The White House tried to regain control of the narrative, sending officials to the podium with talking points that described Steve Witkoff as a valuable voice bringing innovative ideas to the table. But for many Americans, that defense only reinforced the problem. Innovation was not what they wanted in a moment of geopolitical brinkmanship. They wanted strength. And it was strength, Jasmine Crockett argued, that Witkoff had failed to provide. That evening, Crockett appeared on a primetime broadcast, her composure as sharp as her words. With millions watching, she laid out her critique point by point. Steve Witkoff did not enter those negotiations as a statesman, she declared. He entered as an investor. He thought like a man calculating returns, not like a leader protecting a nation. And that distinction is not just symbolic. It is dangerous. The anchor pressed her on whether she was accusing Witkoff of undermining U.S. security. Crockett's reply was immediate. If you treat Moscow like a business partner, you embolden their ambitions. And America cannot afford to embolden its adversaries. The remarks reverberated across the airwaves, sparking heated debate on every major network. Supporters praised her candor, calling it the kind of truth-telling Washington too often avoids. Critics accused her of grandstanding, but even they conceded that her words captured the unease felt by ordinary citizens. Social media erupted with memes portraying Witkoff holding real estate contracts instead of diplomatic briefs, tagged with hashtags like investor, not defender, and wrong man at the table. Meanwhile, editorial boards weighed in, many noting the striking optics. A billionaire developer positioned as America's voice in front of one of its fiercest adversaries. "This is not how diplomacy is supposed to look," read one scathing column. "America's credibility is not a bargaining chip." International reactions were equally sharp, with European officials quietly voicing alarm at reports of Witkoff's transactional tone. One diplomat told a British newspaper, "It is hard to trust in the ironclad commitments of a nation when its negotiators speak like brokers of a commercial deal." As the debate raged, it became clear that Jasmine Crockett had tapped into a growing sentiment, that the administration had blurred the line between governance and business, loyalty and competence. Her words transformed the controversy from whispers of inexperience into a full-blown accusation of recklessness. For Steve Witkoff, the label of investor not defender threatened to define him in the public eye. And for Crockett, the path was set. She would not let go until the truth of August 15th was fully dragged into the light. By the fifth day after the August 15th negotiations, the controversy surrounding Steve Witkoff had burst out of the news cycle and into the streets. What began as skeptical commentary in Washington had grown into visible unrest as protesters gathered outside the State Department and the White House. Their signs spoke volumes. "America is not for sale," "Security over business," and "Witkoff out." Crowds chanted slogans that echoed across social media, where hashtags like #conflict of interest and #developer diplomacy surged. For ordinary Americans, the issue was no longer abstract. It was personal. Many saw Witkoff's presence not just as a symbol of misplaced priorities, but as a dangerous merging of private interests with public duty. Editorials in major newspapers hammered the point home, calling it a textbook case of conflict of interest. "A billionaire developer," one columnist wrote, has no business negotiating with adversaries while his empire stands to benefit from trade openings. Cable networks replayed montages of Witkoff's luxury properties alongside footage of Russian negotiators, drawing a damning contrast between his personal wealth and the stakes of national security. International commentators piled on, warning that America looked compromised, its foreign policy blurred by the fingerprints of private capital. Jasmine Crockett seized the narrative with fierce determination. Appearing before a massive crowd on the Capitol lawn, she delivered a fiery address. Steve Witkoff represents himself, not America. He thinks like a developer, not a defender. And when he sat across from Moscow, he wasn't protecting our families. He was protecting his interests. Her words thundered across the plaza, amplified by speakers and repeated on live streams viewed by millions. Almost instantly, the phrase, defender, not developer, became a rallying cry. Behind closed doors, members of Congress began murmuring about the need for hearings. Allies in Europe expressed alarm, quietly telling American lawmakers that confidence in U.S. leadership was eroding. One diplomat was quoted anonymously saying, "If America sends businessmen instead of diplomats, then how can we trust that commitments are made for security, not profit?" For Witkoff, the pressure was suffocating. Once introduced as a loyal confidant of the president, he was now framed as the embodiment of everything critics despised about mixing business with politics. And for Jasmine Crockett, the path forward was obvious. She would not rest until the issue reached the floor of Congress. The scandal had moved beyond optics. It was now a battle over whether America's foreign policy had been sold to the highest bidder. By the 6th day after the August 15th negotiations, the fallout from Steve Witkoff's role had crossed America's borders and shaken its alliances. In European capitals, officials spoke with growing unease, hinting that Washington's credibility had been undermined by the spectacle of a billionaire businessman negotiating alongside the President and Secretary of State. NATO diplomats, usually cautious in their wording, released a rare statement stressing that clarity and commitment are essential for deterrence. Behind the scenes, allies were blunter. One senior European envoy told a London paper, "If America sends investors instead of diplomats, then our trust in its security guarantees is called into question." The criticism resonated back home, where news outlets plastered headlines such as "Allies Losing Confidence" and "Witkoff Casts Shadow Over NATO." Pundits replayed clips of his stiff posture during the summit, contrasting them with reports of his transactional remarks, and framed him as the symbol of an administration blurring the line between public duty and private interests. The growing perception was not merely of inexperience, it was of recklessness that endangered global stability. Jasmine Crockett seized this international unease as fuel for her crusade. Standing before reporters, she declared, "When our allies lose faith in us, the consequences are global. Steve Witkoff's actions did not just embarrass America, they weakened the entire alliance we depend on. This is not a matter of partisan politics. This is about national security, and it demands a full investigation." Her demand reverberated across Washington. Several lawmakers, emboldened by the public outcry and the pressure from allies abroad, privately signaled support. Committees began drafting preliminary requests for documents tied to Witkoff's role in the negotiations. Meanwhile, protesters outside the Capitol raised their voices louder, chanting, "Investigate now!" and "America is not for sale." Placards bore Crockett's words, "Defender, not developer," as if they were a new political slogan. Inside the administration, aides scrambled to contain the damage, dismissing the calls for inquiry as political theater. But the momentum had shifted. Crockett's framing of Witkoff as a dangerous liability, combined with international voices questioning America's reliability, gave the scandal an unstoppable energy. The question was no longer if Congress would act, it was when. And with every passing hour, the pressure on Steve Witkoff grew heavier. His role at the table on August 15th now threatening to define his legacy in the worst possible way. The storm that had been building for nearly a week finally broke into a full-scale confrontation. On the morning of August 21st, Representative Jasmine Crockett strode into the House chamber with a thick folder of documents under her arm. Cameras followed her every step, and the air crackled with anticipation. As she took the floor, silence fell, broken only by the sound of her voice carrying across the chamber. This is not a moment for hesitation. This is a moment for accountability. She began methodically, outlining Steve Witkoff's presence at the August 15th negotiations, the troubling leaks of his transactional language, and the international outcry that had followed. Point by point, she built the case that his role was not only inappropriate, but dangerous. Steve Witkoff treated national security like a business deal, she declared. He thought in terms of profits and concessions when the stakes were measured in lives and alliances. That is not diplomacy. That is dereliction. Her words reverberated like a gavel striking down. As Crockett spoke, television networks cut to live coverage, filling screens across America with her accusations. Outside the Capitol, crowds erupted in cheers, waving placards that read, "Defender, not developer," and "Investigate now." Online, hashtags like #Crockett versus Witkoff and #America, not for sale, surged to the top of trending lists. Editorials hailed her as the rare lawmaker willing to challenge not only an individual, but the very culture of cronyism and blurred loyalties in Washington. When she reached her conclusion, Crockett dropped the bombshell that many had expected. She was introducing a formal motion for Congress to investigate Witkoff's conduct during the negotiations and to subpoena all records tied to his role as special envoy. The chamber erupted, supporters applauding, detractors shouting, but the momentum was undeniable. For Steve Witkoff, the weight of the scandal was now transformed into an official inquiry. For Jasmine Crockett, it was the culmination of a campaign that had carried her from sharp critic to national figurehead in less than a week. As the session ended, the cameras lingered on Crockett's determined expression, the chants of protesters still audible outside the chamber. This was more than a political clash. It was the birth of a defining narrative about who had the courage to defend America and who had failed it. And as journalists reminded viewers, the story was far from over. So, stay with us. Because the next chapter in this unfolding drama could reshape not only Steve Witkoff's future, but the future of American diplomacy itself. Subscribe, follow, and watch closely, because the fight for courage is only just beginning.